how are we to forgive like Christ when a relative has been and is still abusive? And this could relate to the 9 a.m. service. How you honor your father or your mother if that's the relative that may be abusing you.
Okay, yeah. How do you, what was the first part of it? What with your parents?
How are we to forgive like Christ when a
parents.
relative has been and is still abusive?
Okay, so let me talk a little bit about what forgiveness means on the front side, because I think that there's a cultural understanding of forgiveness that's not the same as the biblical understanding. Oftentimes when you hear forgiveness, you hear a phrase that goes with it. You guys can fill in the blank. Forgive and... Okay, not only is this not biblical, I don't think it's possible, and oftentimes it's not smart, okay? Forgive and forget. If you're in an abusive situation, it's just downright dumb to forget that there's an abuser that's out there, particularly if you are in the same household or under the authority of that person that is the abuser. What forgiveness means biblically is to release the bitterness that you're holding against somebody. Forgiveness is something that is 100% in your power to be able to say, I'm going to release the anger and the bitterness and the poison that's inside of my soul that's geared towards that person. And I just want to say as a side note, the other person does not have to say, I'm sorry, or repent, or change for this to be able to happen. If you say, I'm not going to forgive somebody unless they apologize to me, who has the power on whether or not you forgive? It's the other person. And you do not want to give the other person the power about bitterness. Bitterness is something that you think you're holding against the other person, but who does it poison? It poisons you. It poisons your own soul. So when Jesus says forgive, he's talking about releasing the bitterness, the anger, the need for revenge that there is against that person, and anybody can forgive. Now, the next question related to that is, okay, if I forgive a person, does that necessarily mean that I should reconcile with that person? And the answer is usually, but not always. Usually, but not always. Most of the time when you're forgiving somebody, you forgive them of the wrong that was against you, and you can continue to be in relationship with them and keep moving on. In fact, I would say for most relationships, most of the time, forgiveness is required for you to keep on moving forward in that relationship. But when you're talking about a perpetually abusive relationship, reconciliation is oftentimes not wise for you to go to. To continue to go back to that person, to continue to be under that person's authority is something that's just not wise. And when it's a family member, sometimes cutting off that relationship is the right thing to do morally. Because if you say my choices are to cut myself off or remain in an abusive relationship, cutting off or just setting up appropriate boundaries with that person is a healthy thing to do. Sometimes it doesn't mean you cut them off totally, but it means you limit the amount of time that you talk to them, that you're subject to them, that you visit them, or the context within which that happens, or if there's, long visits or overnight visits or those types of things, is sometimes just the wise thing to do. So you can forgive them and establish boundaries. You can forgive them and even say, my boundaries are that I'm not going to relate to that person anymore, because forgiveness is about your internal world and your attitude towards that person and not about the way that the relationship continues on. And now Jesus says that we always should not have revenge towards that person. Revenge is God's. And so forgiveness or non-forgiveness never relates to revenge, but forgiveness is always about what happens in your inner world as you release the bitterness towards the other person. So how do you do that? Oftentimes that forgiveness is a process. Forgiveness can be a challenging thing. My favorite book on this is called Forgive and Forget by Lou Smedes, ironically. Lou Smedes is a professor, and kind of one of his premises in the book is that forgive and forget is oftentimes impossible or ridiculous. And so that's partly why I like the book. But it's a great book on working through the process of forgiveness in your own soul. And if that's something that you're working on, I would highly recommend it. There's actually, I think, 3 books by Lou Smedes on this, Lewsmedes. One of them is The Art of Forgiving, and I forget the third title, but they're all great. And he's kind of my go-to guy on the forgiveness question.